Hello, everybody. Today we're going to be talking about Chapter 4, Ethical Guidelines for Psychological Research. And this is a chapter that is really interesting. In fact, you could take a whole semester talking about ethical guidelines for research. So hopefully you'll enjoy the reading of this chapter. So the importance of ethics in research. Um, there was a study called the Tuskegee syphilis study that for an assignment this week, I'm going to ask you to do a little research on and read up. It's in your textbook as well. But this was a 40-year study that recruited Black males who had syphilis to look at the untreated effects of the disease. They were basically looking to see how the disease affected the body. And in fact, when penicillin was recognized as a treatment in 1943, which you can see is 10 years after the start of the study, um, people in the study were actually told or were actually withheld from getting the treatment. In fact, they weren't told that there was an effective treatment, and the participants that they used were typically very poor, illiterate, Black men, and so they really were able to manipulate them into being part of this research study. The study was stopped in 1973. Um, as you can see, many, many years of this unethical research study. When we talk about ethics, maybe this is one that's a little more on the borderline, the Milgram study. I'm going to ask you to write about this as well as in an assignment for this week. But this was a study on obedience. You probably remember learning about the Milgram study in Psych 101 or in social psychology, where participants were told that they were being recruited to be part of a memory study when in fact it was a study on obedience. And participants were tricked into believing that they were administering a very strong shock to a learner in the study. The learner was, of course, a Confederate, so no one was actually getting hurt, but the participant in the study believed that they were shocking and hurting the learner in the research study. And the participants experienced extreme stress. So the Tuskegee study that you'll read more about illustrates three major unethical choices. Participants were not treated respectfully. In fact, participants were harmed, and participants were a targeted, disadvantaged social group. All of these three are unethical choices that were made. The Milgram obedience study illustrates more of this difficult ethical balance about, is it ethical to do a study like this, where we certainly learned a lot. You know that you hear about the Milgram study in almost every psychology class. So we did learn a lot, but we placed the participants in quite a lot of stress. And so we'll talk about how you would make the choice of whether running a study is ethical or not, the importance of debriefing, which is going to be an important ethical guideline, and basically the idea of balancing the risk to participants with the benefit to society. And that ends up being the way we decide our ethical, whether something is ethical or not, is looking at this balance of risk versus benefit. And other types of unethical behavior is just plain fabrication or falsification of data. Clearly, that's unethical, but there have been people who have done that. And in fact, one of the most well-known examples of fabricating data was the initial study of Dr. Wakefield, who published a report that talked about the connection between vaccines and autism. After that study was published, there was certainly a huge amount of fallout in terms of parents not wanting to vaccinate their children. And so other studies were done. You can see here that there was no connection found between autism and vaccines in many, many studies on many, many children. You can see 500 children, 10,000 children. Here's a study of 535,000 children, etc. And so no link to autism was found in any of the case in all of the studies. And basically, that initial study was falsified. But as you know, you've probably heard about the potential link between vaccines and autism. It all came from this original study, and that has had huge impacts around around the world. Here's just some information about vaccines and what happens when people refuse vaccines. Again, all based on this falsifiable data. So, in terms of ethical principles, the Belmont report lists the principles and applications for ethical research. The main principles here are the principle of respect for persons. Importantly, we're going to talk about informed consent. I'll go over here actually. Well, we'll come back to that. You can't coerce participants, meaning you aren't able to force someone to be part of your research study. You aren't allowed to say, well, who does research studies? A lot of times it's doctors. You're not able to say, well, I won't be your doctor if you don't participate in my research study. Or professors can't say, well, you can't get an A in this class unless you participate in my research study. There can be no coercion. And we need to protect special groups, particularly children, people with cognitive disabilities, prisoners. There's extra special protections, and you have to actually reach a much higher ethical bar to protect these special groups. The principle of benefits, protecting participants from harm. We don't want to harm our research participants, and weighing risks and benefits. We'll look at the next slide for those details, but we need to weigh the risks and benefits, and then the principle of justice. So in terms of informed consent, this is a really important piece of ethical research in that participants agree to participate in your research study after being informed about what the study is about. The Tuskegee study, participants didn't know what the study was about and weren't given the information they needed in order to consent to the study. So, an informed consent, it's basically a written out piece of paper, kind of like a permission slip when you were younger and go on a field trip or something like that. Your parents had to sign a permission slip. And participants agree to participate after they're told about what they're getting into, what's the purpose of the study, potential risks of the study, and potential benefits, that they have a right to refuse or stop participating at any time. That's key in research. You're not allowed to keep people in your research study if they don't want to be. And then justification for exposing participants to any risk. And of course, as the importance of the study increases, the amount of risk that is allowed to be, that participants are allowed to be exposed to, it increases as well. And then participants need to have a written consent, meaning they sign a consent form. And of course, in your informed consent, there's a tension between enough information about what will be done so people are clear about what the study is about before they agree to participate, but not providing too much information that's overwhelming or undermines comprehension. You know, if you put some very expansive, very long, very technical explanation, people might sign it without really understanding what it's about. So you really are needing to create a document that gives enough information, but in a way that people can understand. Risk-benefit analysis is another very important part of this ethical process of research. And the idea is that you actually weigh the risks and the benefits. risks are kind of easy to figure out. What's the risk to the participant? Are you going to harm them? Is there potential of being hurt? You could think about that. If with a medication trial, is there a potential of side effects? But it could be other risks like financial risks that, oh, this study takes a week, so for a week you won't be able to go to work. Or psychological risks. Is this a stressful study? Is there going to be are they going to be exposed to stimuli that might make them sad or angry or anything like that? Um, so you think of all the potential risks to the participant, and the benefits has to be more than we're just interested in this. That's not a benefit. There might be a benefit to the participant themselves. Now, that's a possibility, although isn't always the case. So if they're in a medication trial, well, the benefit might be health related. Maybe they're getting a drug that is going to be effective, and that's a possible benefit to them. Maybe like in my research studies where we do IQ tests and MRIs on children, well, the benefit is they get a free IQ test. They get a free MRI, which typically costs a lot of money and many people don't get. But more often than not, the benefits are more to science and society, kind of the greater good. How is what we learn going to contribute to our knowledge, and how is that going to be potentially helpful to science and society? And so you really do this cost benefit analysis, and you actually write this out as you're proposing a research study. What are the benefits and what are the risks? And so if you have a very low risk and a very high benefit study, you clearly would want to do it. If you have a very high risk study with low benefit, you don't do it. And then we've got these kind of question marks. If you have a low risk study, but there's low benefit, that's more of a, do you do the study? You could think about that. And if it's a very high risk but high benefit study, again, there's more of a question there. Psychological risk and physical risk with children is even more complicated, because while we protect adults quite a bit in our ethical guidelines, we protect children even more. And because children can't consent for themselves, right? Who has the legal right to consent for them? It's their parents. So when you look at research on children, and you might want to look some of this up, maybe you've seen it in other classes. We do attachment studies. This is the stressful situation study where we've learned so much about secure and insecure attachments. And a caregiver brings a child into the laboratory, and then the caregiver leaves the child alone in the laboratory, and there's usually a lot of crying, or the caregiver leaves the child in the room with someone, a stranger, someone who's associated with the research study, of course, but it's someone the child doesn't know. Again, that's very upsetting to the child. And so the question is that an ethical study to do? The child is definitely stressed and crying. Is that an ethical experiment to do? And the Bobo doll experiment, this is the idea of social learning, where children watched many years ago a model, an adult, playing in a very aggressive way with a Bobo doll. That was this clown, like blow up clown that you could punch it kind of and it fell over and popped back up. But the adult they were watching was using aggressive words and punching it, holding it down in a very aggressive way, modeling aggressive behavior. And then children were asked to, were put in a room with a Bobo doll to see what they would do if they would model that type of behavior, which in fact they did do. And the question is that ethical to do to children? What are the short-term risks to the child, and what are those long-term risks to the child? So again, when we're talking about risk, the physical pain, that's easy to identify. The psychological stress, well, do you make someone nervous? Do you see them sweating, trembling, laughter? Do you make them sad? Do you make them doubt themselves? Do you give them lowered self-esteem during the study? We do that all the time, try to say, I wonder if someone who has lowered self-esteem, how will they respond to in some situation? And we may artificially try to lower their self-esteem by giving them a test. And then no matter what their response is on the test, like a math test, we would say, wow, you failed that test. That's actually the lowest score I've ever seen, even though perhaps they did just fine, but we're trying to induce some kind of self-doubt or something like that. And so we're looking at the immediate and long-term effects of this type of stress and risk. The APA, American Psychological Association, also has ethical principles for research, as well as for everything about being a psychologist, but for research as well. And so they add 2 more principles to the Belmont 3. So we still have benefits, we've got justice, we've got respect, but they also add fidelity and responsibility, so establishing trust and responsibility in all professional behavior, including research, and integrity, striving to be accurate and truthful as a researcher, teacher, or practitioner. Another important part of the research process is what we call the IRB, or the Internal Review Board. Any institution that receives funding from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, which is a lot of research that's done here by the NIH, needs to have an internal review board, which is a board of people that consists of faculty at the university or hospital, scientists as well as non-scientists, community members, and legal specialists. And they're all there to review a study before it's done to be sure that it's ethical. And it's important we have faculty, and again, scientists and non-scientists. So you have people looking at it from every perspective. You have community members who aren't part of the university and don't maybe have an intrinsic bias towards, letting the university do certain things. They're able to see it from more of an outside perspective. And of course, the lawyers that have to look at it from a legal perspective. Let me go back here. And so what you do before you actually do a research study is write up a long proposal, and you write out the risks, the entire procedure, write out the risks, you write out the benefits, you write out your informed consent form, you send it all to this IRB who reads it. And then this is very much a peer review type of process where they often give you lots of comments. Did you think about doing this? How about changing this? Rewording some of the informed consent, all of that. And then they send it back to you, you make the changes, back and forth until you finally get the IRB approval. And then once it's approved and found to be ethically okay, then you can go ahead and run your research study, but not before. So ethical decision making is really a balance between the potential harm to human or animal participants and then the knowledge gained from the research. So we do this with human studies in terms of this risk-benefit analysis, as well as with animal studies. So we take just as much care thinking about animal studies as well. One question is the use of deception, so not letting people know exactly what the study is about. So when is deception ethical? Is deception ethical? You can only use deception when full informed consent would compromise the research goals. So whatever the goals are for the study, if you can't figure out a way to complete the study without using deception, then you could sort of think about using deception. So in Milgram's study, for example, the one where participants were told, you're being part of a memory study when actually it was a study on obedience. Was there any other way to do that, right? If you had participants come in and to the lab and say, All right, I'm going to tell you this is a study about memory, but actually this is a study about obedience. And see that shock machine, that really doesn't give the participant any shocks, but I want you to pretend it does. Well, that sort of defeats the whole purpose of the study. So that's when perhaps deception might be justified. And there are two types of deception. There's totally misleading and lying to participants. That's like the Milgram study. That's the most extreme form of deception. And then maybe the second type would be failure to fully disclose all aspects of the study, giving people incomplete information, having participants come in for a cognitive testing session, and you do all sorts of stuff, but you don't let them know that at the end there's going to be a surprise memory test. So you've sort of left something out, and that's another possible way that you could use deception. So when is deception acceptable? Absolutely never if there's another way to study the behavior. So you really have to think about how else can I study this behavior? And then if there really is no other way, then deception is justified by the importance of the research. So if you're asking a very important question, there's no other way to look at that question, then perhaps deception would be justified ethically. What's the solution to deception? Well, that's the idea of debriefing, that after the study, you inform participants about everything. So you don't let people leave the study with the false belief that they were, in Milgram's case, part of a memory study and that they think they actually really hurt somebody, giving them these very extreme shocks. After the study is over, before they leave, you let them know what was the research question, but explain to the participant everything they need, why deception was necessary, and the goal is to remove any negative effects of participation. And this is really important because people will not continue to participate in research if they have a terrible time, right? If they leave there feeling like what they did was just really awful, and then they tell their friends, don't ever do this, it was the worst experience, then that's the end of research. So we really need to be sure that people leave for themselves feeling good about what they participated in, and in a bigger picture for the future of research. In fact, in Milgram's study, there was debriefing. They were assured no shocks were administered. They were given a copy of the research report. And after that, only 1% regretted participating in the study. So it really shows that debriefing really does work. Let's see. These are our ethical standards that are specific to research. We've talked about institutional review boards, informed consent, deception, debriefing. Don't fabricate your data, don't plagiarize, and like I said, animal research is just as important, and we've got ethical standards for that as well. There are legal protection for laboratory animals, there are animal care guidelines, and so we could talk about this for sure for a very long time. But basically, again, researchers try to do this ethical balance of animal welfare, animal rights, and animal research. You have another assignment this week on Facebook and the emotional contagion. This is a really interesting study that over a 1-week period in 2012, researchers manipulated the news feed for a random sample of close to 700,000 Facebook users. The news feed is constantly updating list of content from your friends, shows up in the middle of the Facebook page. Because there are more stories that can typically be displayed, Facebook uses an algorithm that tries to show the stories a user would find most engaging or relevant. And so they randomly sampled 700,000 people. One group had reduced negative content, meaning they used an algorithm to take out some of the more negative stories, and one group had reduced positive content, meaning they used an algorithm to take out some of the positive stories. They used this software to determine the emotionality of the content. And the hypothesis was that subsequent user posts to Facebook would be affected by what they saw in the news feed. That's the idea of the emotional contagion. That if you're in the positivity reduced group, then you would post less positive posts. And if you were in the negativity reduced group, you would post less negative posts. And in fact, results supported that hypothesis that people's emotions might be affected by what their friends say and what they see on the news feed. That's the social contagion idea. The controversy is that Facebook users weren't asked whether they wanted to participate in the study. Ooh, sorry about that. My computer is doing something. Here's the, look at that, the Facebook data use policy. But I want to show you this. Participants were not asked whether they wanted to participate. It was assumed that because they read the data use policy, that really went for informed consent, that participants or users of Facebook knew their data might be used for such research, and that's because in that long data use policy, it says that Facebook uses information for internal operations, including troubleshooting, data analysis, testing, research, and service improvement. And so your assignment, which is in this module, is to think about what issues were raised by this study and could Facebook have addressed the hypothesis without explicitly manipulating the content of the newsfeed. All right, everybody, thank you so much. Bye.